students. In this course on introducing sociology, today we are going to begin with the module on enlightenment. Sociology emerged in the 19th century in a particular context that was marked by dissolution of the old order. Everything that was held to be close to heart of the people seemed to simply change, and drastically. Marx perhaps captured this sort of a situation best in these words: all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. Everything, all that was considered immutable, sacred, solid, simply melted away under certain forces. And we can identify certain events as being primarily responsible for this kind of a situation. A massive transformation that was taking place in Western Europe from around the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries that gave rise to the discipline called sociology in the 19th century. Now, what are these forces? What are these events? There was the scientific revolution, the technological revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries that had been responsible in creating some of the future events that we would consider as immediately responsible for the condition of society at that time, and which led to the emergence of the discipline called sociology. Let us now focus first on the Enlightenment. What was the Enlightenment and where did it take place? It took place primarily in Western Europe, France, Germany, Scotland, England, and also parts of Italy, that created a kind of thought that was to revolutionize philosophy and our understanding of what we may term as the social. Now, prior to the emergence of the Enlightenment, what happened is that we used to consider that God had created the world and that human beings were simply to live that life. True, there was the Renaissance, and there are certain sociologists like Randall Collins who would believe that the Renaissance had an important role to play. It had, but for our purposes, we would consider the Enlightenment as that watershed in history. Enlightenment's motto that Kant gave was dare to know, or in German, sapere aude. It invited us to think, humans to think about their social arrangements, about institutions they were living in, and thereby understand how they worked, how they came into being, the processes involved, and also to mount a critique. Enlightenment thinkers used to call themselves as philosophers. These thinkers argued that humans have the right to know about society, and they must know because they are living in these social arrangements, and therefore they should be the ones to decide upon what society is like, what it should be like. So, we would move on to an understanding of what were the basic principles of the Enlightenment. First and foremost, reason. They believed that human beings are born with the ability to reason, that they are capable of thinking rationally. And they clubbed reason with empiricism. And here we find the influence of Newton the most. Therefore, reason combined with empiricism was one of the earliest pillars and the principles of Enlightenment thought. Science. Science seemed the basis on which Enlightenment thinkers began to argue their case. Now, why science? Science made possible for the first time an objective form of knowledge based on nothing but facts. Therefore, such facts, such knowledge was above any kind of ideological, religious, individual dispute. For instance, say, I don't like this fact. I think this is the fact. Fine, science would say, go ahead, prove it. And prove it factually, prove it empirically, prove it with reason. And once they fail, then those facts would not be considered scientific facts and the basis for knowledge. So what did science do then? Science challenged existing authority, primarily that of the church and of the absolutist state. So now, Voltaire was among the Enlightenment thinkers who did believe in an enlightened absolute monarchy. For instance, Catherine the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia. However, in general, Enlightenment thinking could be considered as standing against the ideas propagated by the church and the rule of the absolutist monarchs or the absolutist state. So, church, the state, and also the family came under the scanner of reason. Human beings, now being the first principle of Enlightenment reason, that human beings were born with the ability to reason, should be able to judge whether the institutions and the values were rational and reasonable. Any institution, any set of values that failed to pass the test of reason was to be discarded. And we have already spoken about empiricism as the one that was based on your five senses. Anything that could not be judged by the five senses or any of the five senses was to be ruled out. So therefore, Enlightenment ruled out sixth sense. We often seem to be banking on sixth sense, but Enlightenment thinkers simply rubbished that claim. Now, science, as we move on to that. Science, as I have said, gave the basis for objective knowledge beyond individual ideological dispute, beyond value judgment. Moreover, why did, as Hamilton had said, and see, we are going to base our lecture mostly on Peter Hamilton's essay, Enlightenment and the Birth of Social Sciences, and Irving Zitlin's book on ideology and the development of social theory. Now, coming to the idea of science, why did, as Hamilton says, the Enlightenment thinkers infatuated with science? There were several reasons. One is, of course, as we have pointed out, the basis of objective knowledge based on hard facts, based on a combination of reason and empiricism and experimentation. What did these lead to? Science was able to make innovations, discoveries like the vaccine, inoculation, that would help humans deal with a deadly disease like smallpox. The creation of dams, the building of dams, the predictability that science could predict natural disasters. So while we could not stop natural disasters, but we could certainly ensure that damage to human lives and property could be controlled or even minimized. All these led to an increase in the rate of living. They could live more human beings. And therefore, it led to a decrease in rates of mortality. That was definitely the singular achievement of science. And as Enlightenment philosophers, or the thinkers, wanted to create knowledge, factual knowledge, real objective knowledge, science provided that foothold. They could launch their critique against what they called superstition or not knowledge, but which the church once considered as knowledge, and the church still perhaps considers it as knowledge. Now, the church considered itself to be the guardians of that knowledge. What was it based on? On the scriptures, on revelations, on religious teachings. The Enlightenment philosophers, mind you, they were not really atheists. A few of them were, but most of them were believers. And they believed, and they created a kind of deism. They believed that God had created the world and left the functioning of the world to humans. And therefore, it is now up to the humans to make their society work and take them to greater heights. So therefore, church and church-based knowledge, based on scriptures, on revelations, could not form the basis of knowledge. The basis of knowledge was to be formed only by science. So therefore, there were a host of factors that made these philosophers believe in science, and that science could lead to progress, science could make human society move ahead. And indeed, it was science and scientific knowledge which should be applied, as the Enlightenment thinkers thought, to the world of human beings, to the social world, that could make them happy as well. Okay, we move on to the next principle. Universalism. What is universalism? That science has laws, science has facts, which are applicable across the universe, at all places, without exception. Take, for instance, the case of the laws of gravity. You may want to jump out of the terrace, and you may wish that you will go up and not fall down. You may perhaps pray that I go up. Perhaps you are doing an experimentation. Don't try it, but it's just an example. Will you go up? No, you will go down. Because the laws of gravity would work that way. Perhaps in mountainous regions, your fall would take a little bit of time than it would in a plain region, but you would still fall down and not go up. Okay, so without exceptions, these laws are applicable across all places in the universe. We come to one of the most contentious, but also one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment thought, one of its basic principles, progress. The infinite perfectibility of humans. That humans, precisely because they were endowed with the abilities of reason, they could apply reason to ensure they progressed. And this sort of a state was infinite, so there was no stopping human progress. They could make themselves perfectible over and over again, and thereby their own institutions, their own social arrangements, their own society would progress. I just want to say one more thing. Enlightenment thinkers with perhaps the exception of Montesquieu, really did not give a definition of society. Montesquieu didn't give a definition of society as such, but what lacked in Enlightenment thought was precisely the idea of society, which we will take up when we look at the development of sociology and what it focused on initially. So progress was the hallmark of Enlightenment thought. From there, we move on to individualism. That the individual existed and that the individual had rights and the individual could not be violated. Indeed, Enlightenment thinkers believed that society was nothing more than an aggregate of individuals. So it began with making the individual central to social arrangements, central to what we call society, and central to their own thought. It's a cluster of ideas, Enlightenment, and definitely there were more principles beyond what we are going to talk about. And even the principles that we mention were not always followed or were not held in the same measure by all Enlightenment thinkers. That also we are going to talk about as and when we come to that. So individual was at the center of Enlightenment thought, and the idea of individual rights had emerged. Toleration. What is toleration? Against religious persecution. That society and humans must value tolerance, and states must stop religious persecution, particularly of non-Christians, the Jews. Progress would lead to freedom, and that every human being would have the right to freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of access, absolute free access to information, because it is on the basis of that, on the basis of free access to all information available, that human beings can judge with reason what is right and what is wrong, and thereby lead to the progress of their own selves and the progress of society, also of their social institutions and social arrangements. So therefore, freedom of speech was also absolutely a necessity for Enlightenment thinkers. A society or a state that did not give that freedom of information, access to information, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of mobility, that society was a bad society. That state was a bad state. Uniformity of human nature was more linked to French Enlightenment. It was a distinct feature of French Enlightenment. What is it? That human beings and their nature, so the nature of human beings was basically the same, uniform everywhere. What we see are the empirical variations of that nature. And how would that variation be accounted for? And here comes in where we may say, in a nascent way, the social. That environmental, political, social, cultural, geographical contexts determined how human nature would manifest itself. And therefore, depending on these changed environments of social, cultural, political, ecological, geographical, we see variations in human nature. The church was not supreme, and neither was European Christianity. That we should not consider the other races and believers, followers of other religions, inferior to that of Europeans and European Christianity. Again, this aspect of that is linked with uniformity of human nature, that these people need not be considered as inferior, was a strong feature of the French Enlightenment. For instance, the Scottish Enlightenment did believe in a stadial model and did consider European society as having reached the pinnacle of that evolution. Following what we have already discussed earlier, the Enlightenment thinkers found that the church, the absolutist state, and the family were unreasonable, irrational institutions that inhibited human progress and that these should be abolished. From there we come to, let us say, the 4 identifying principles, the central features of the Enlightenment. 1 was therefore anti-clericalism. 2, there was this massive enthusiasm for empirical and materialist knowledge, upholding of that knowledge, combined with their enthusiasm for the technical and medical progress that science had made so far, and also there was a desire to institute constitutional reform. Now, following this, let us then move on to see how Enlightenment could be linked with, specifically with science, modernity, and finally to the emergence of sociology. With science, first, we have said that science and its principles, which was applicable to the natural world, could be applied to understand the human world, human nature, and human society. On the basis of this, a small group of sciences called the human sciences, the moral sciences, were emerged. At that time, it wasn't called the social sciences, but the human and moral sciences had emerged. It was a small group of sciences that tried to study human nature through the applicability of scientific principles. And the encyclopedia, that was a huge project of the Enlightenment, spanning into so many volumes, became the primary project of the Enlightenment. That was the primary program of the Enlightenment that followed these principles. So therefore, human world could be studied through the applicability of scientific principles. And indeed, the philosophers believed that science could produce a basis for future secular values. And if we would just bring in one of the most remarkable classical sociologists, Émile Durkheim, in his study of religion, also believed that science could provide that foundation to secular values and the creation of a civil religion. All right? Now, from what was the Enlightenment's then specific contributions besides the applicability of scientific knowledge and besides the formation of a small group of human and moral sciences? It created a new secular intelligentsia. It created secular modes of cross-cultural communication. It helped create a secular audience, a modern audience that was receptive to secular and scientific ideas of the Enlightenment. And it created those modern institutions through which communication could be made. And we would be familiar with those: the scientific academy, the conference, the journal, the learned journal. We now move on to its specific relation to the birth of sociology. Science was the epitome of reason, and we have already discussed why. And it upheld the principle of naturalism. What is that? That the cause and effect sequences that helped us in understanding the natural world could also be applied in our study of the social world. Then, control of prejudice. In this science, played a remarkable role, and the Enlightenment, that science, because it is beyond any kind of dispute, ideological dispute, religious dispute, individual dispute, it could control prejudice. And if we based our understanding on the facts provided by science through reason, empiricism, and experimentation, then we could automatically control prejudice. And these two gave rise to the scientific method and cultural relativism. Through this, the social sciences could carve out their areas of study and methods of inquiry. Now, finally, when sociology emerged, what task did it have? Cross-cultural comparison was the hallmark of all sociologists, particularly when we look at Auguste Comte, his law of 3 stages we would see, then Émile Durkheim. These were all based on cross-cultural comparison. However, Enlightenment thought lacked in definition of society. This is where Saint-Simon and a few years later his apprentice Auguste Comte provided us with a definition of society as an entity that is over and above the individual, that it was not a mere summation of its parts. It's not a mere summation of its institutions and the individuals. It was over and above the individuals. So therefore, early sociologists began to apply the scientific method for the study of the human world. Auguste Comte focused on the predictability of science and the ability of science to ameliorate the human condition, and that therefore the laws, the natural social laws, could be identified following the scientific method that would aid in understanding society and making society better. So cross-cultural comparison, control of prejudice, naturalism, the scientific method, and the contribution of the sociologists was to study sociology in a holistic manner. So therefore, we can finally come to our conclusion of how sociology emerged or took birth with Enlightenment thought. Science, its applicability, its universality, cross-cultural comparison, a secular means of communication and a secular audience, free from all prejudices, all that would be considered as unreasonable institutions and value systems. And therefore, sociology, when it emerged, had to keep all these things in mind. Thank you.